Welcome back. Today, we're looking at the creepiest and most pants-crapping paranormal experiences. Don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. Not my story. My brother was driving his date home after a long day of work and a night out with some girl he was seeing. It was a late night or early morning, I think 2:30 a.m. The girl was sleeping in the passenger seat, and I guess he started dozing off. He is normally a great driver and has always been the designated driver on nights out with friends. But he said he was truly very tired, and there were no cars on the highway. I guess the cool breeze on his face and quiet made him drowsy, and he started to drift off. He said he did not even feel his eyes close, but all of a sudden he hears my dad yell, "Wake up, Dave." He woke up just in time to stop himself from running off the road down a precipice. He said it scared the shit out of him. Our dad had passed away a few months before. Later, my brother told me that my dad and he would often go out driving together, just the two of them. Our father drove a lot as part of his job and had licenses to operate most land vehicles. He taught my brother about defensive driving and always warned him about driving while sleepy. I like to think it was my dad making sure his son didn't crash his car. Around 5 years ago, however, I was in my room about 10 p.m. and I had a song playing off my phone. My window was open. My window goes onto our back garden, but we have an extension out back with a large flat roof that is impossible to climb onto from any direction without breaking into our garden. My window was open the entire time, and I never heard any movement outside, but I was sitting at the window, and I hummed along to the song, only to have it hum back at me in a completely different voice from my own. Directly outside of the window, about 6 inches from my face. I freaked out as soon as I heard it and grabbed my phone. I shone my torch all around the roof, and there was nobody there whatsoever. After that day, my game consoles, back then my PS3 and PS4, would turn on in the middle of the night while I was lying in bed with the controllers on my cabinet, so I never touched them. The discs that were inside the consoles would eject, and instead of stopping halfway like they're supposed to, they dropped and rolled along the carpet a few feet. This happened every single night, and it terrified me every single time. The last time it ever happened, I remember being woken up at about 2 a.m. to my PS4 turning on by itself and the disc ejecting, and I was mad because I had an exam the next day, so I said out loud, "Fuck off, I don't have time for this anymore." The disc never fell from the console, and it never happened again. My other strangest encounter was when I was home alone for a week while my parents went on holiday. I had just gotten out of the shower and was upstairs in my room, getting changed. While I was up there, I could hear the sound of water running from downstairs. I thought I just left the shower dripping instead of turning it off all the way by accident and went down to turn it off. When I got down there, both of the taps on our sink were turned on full blast and spraying water out of the sink, which I know I didn't do. I would obviously remember that. I ended up staying at a family friend's house because it terrified me so much at the time. Okay, this happened a few days ago. It was the first time I experienced this, and it was terrifying. It was about 2:50 in the morning. My brother, 11, and I, 16, were on our bed. We share the same bed, and I began feeling really warm and sweating because we are kind of poor and have a small fan that doesn't give much breeze, so I decided to go to a bed that we had in the living room because there was a big fan that gave a good amount of breeze. So, I got up, told my brother I was sleeping outside, and went my way. I turned on the fan and laid down on the bed. A few minutes later, I was dozing off when I felt like I could not move. I tried really hard, but it felt like it would hurt if I did move, so I instead tried to call out to my brother, who was not very far from the living room, but when I tried to speak, I could not. I was only able to make these noises that sounded like snores, and it made me feel very short-breathed. I then tried my hardest to speak again, but my lips only quivered. I then heard this voice behind me whispering, "Be careful." I was terrified at this point, and then I was able to move again. I immediately turned around and sprinted back to the bed with my brother. I have never been that terrified before, and it hasn't happened since that one time. I've had quite a few stories in a house when I used to live in Guadalajara, Mexico. Some crazy shit happened to my family in there, but this happened just to me. When I was around 10 or 12 years old, I used to love doing some camping in the living room. I had a little indoor camping house that was semi-transparent so I could see on every side when I was inside. I remember that thing being SpongeBob themed and everything. I used to put some pillows and blankets in the living room. Nothing really happened a lot of those days, but that day was the last one I would sleep in there. I remember waking up in the middle of the night and pretty much feeling a weird sensation around me. Right next to the couch was a little desk with a lamp, and a Bible was open so the family could read it. I was feeling uncomfortable, and I don't know why, but I decided to watch in that desk direction. I found a really tall shadow figure around 6 feet tall, watching straight up to that Bible, and the cloth of it resembled one of those old monks you see in the medieval age, like a Catholic monk of those times. I couldn't see his face, but there was a good reason for it. He had his hood on, and on the area of the face, I could see a shining yellow/gold light coming from there. He was just still, not doing anything at all, just watching down to the Bible. I was frozen in fear, and I was even shaking, and I couldn't even scream because I was so scared of that thing doing something to me. I was just there for about 30 minutes, but it felt like hours. I was looking around and trying to think about what to do. Suddenly, I saw how it evaporated and disappeared completely without a trace, and in the next few seconds, I see how my mom comes out of her room just to go for something in the kitchen. I was so in shock that I couldn't talk to her at that moment, and she just walked back to her room. That figure never came back, but it took me a really long while to gain my sleep again. I talked to my dads and my grandma about it the next morning, and I remember my grandma telling me that a few days ago, she saw the same figure in my room at night. I clarify here that every time she would visit us and stay there in my house, we gave her my room so she could sleep in there for a few days. I or anyone else in the house saw that figure ever again. My therapist told me that in the 90s she was driving on a 2-lane road in Arizona with her client, whose wife was a few months pregnant. The lane she was going on was to drive to town, and the lane that was next to her lane was to drive out of town. And also, she was driving in the desert, and off the road was just flat, plain, dry land with literally almost nothing in there besides a few bushes. On the day she was driving, it was a very windy day. When she was driving, she saw a mobile home coming up on the next lane. It was a few miles away, so she didn't think of it. When it started getting closer, the wind blew the mobile home of the trailer and sent it sliding into the next lane. Then she had no idea what was even happening because it was all happening so fast, until she said that she saw a baby on the right side of her window floating in the air and said, "Drive towards the light." Which meant the sun, she thinks. She drove off the road into a bush as the 7 cars behind her scrambled to get out of the way. She said that nobody got hurt that day, and 1 car was hit. Then, when her client's wife had a baby and started growing up into her toddler years, she remembered the baby-like person she saw, and it looked exactly like her, she said. Now the baby has grown up into her own 20s, and my therapist sees her as her guardian angel. This one was from my mom, and it never fails to creep me out. When she was pregnant with my sister, she met a strange woman in an elevator. It was in the evening, after work, and my mom was on the way to a family event being held at someone's apartment. She said the woman had long hair, wore a coat, and had an umbrella in her hand. When they got into the lift, my mom asked which floor so that she could press the button for her. The woman didn't respond and just glared. She said that throughout the whole elevator ride, the woman stared at her with so much anger and hatred that she started to feel unsafe. The elevator doors opened, and my mom exited quickly. She heard the woman get off on the same floor behind her. They start walking. At first, my mom thought that it was a coincidence that they were going the same way until she realized that the woman was following her. My mom kept going until she reached the apartment and knocked on the door. Then she turned around to confront the woman, but there was no one there. My uncle answered the door, and my mom asked whether he saw anyone behind her. He said no. I was alone downstairs one night when I was young, and I was watching TV on a TV that faced a large glass sliding door that goes outside. I heard a faint knock at the glass sliding door, and when I looked over, I saw what looked to be an apparition in a white lab coat type of jacket right outside the door. Scared the shit out of me, I ran upstairs. Even to this day, that room creeps me out at night. I believe it was a man, even though he had no face or anything like that. All I really saw was the apparition of a person and the faint white lab coat type of thing it was wearing. The strange thing is that earlier that day my friend was over and we played outside for most of the time, and he said something about a man in a white lab coat in the woods, but I thought he was joking or something, and we joked about throwing rocks into the woods to scare him off. I have a ton of paranormal stories, mainly because I've had lots of deaths in my family. I've seen some weird paranormal shit and have the photos to prove it all. When I was about 14, my friend and I and my sister and her friend were playing hide and seek in the woods at night. I decided one time, when my friend and I were hiding behind a giant bush, to whip out my brand new phone and randomly try to take a picture of myself with the little bit of light that was shining through the bush from the outside lights. Days later, I looked at the photo, and what was in the photo is still amazing to me. It was some sort of apparition of a demon dog. That's the only way I can explain it. It looked like a dog from hell. It had its mouth unnaturally wide open and had huge, sharp teeth, looking like it was trying to bite my head. I showed anyone and everyone that photo. Fucking nuts. Another time was when my sister and I went to a family member's party, who was a very spiritual person, and there was this girl who kept insisting on summoning or calling some ghosts, or something like that. I can't remember the exact word she used, and even though the family member said no, everyone thinks she did. Why? When the photos my family member took were checked the next day, in the living room, there was a young kid sitting in one of the chairs, there were 2 spirits or apparitions sitting on the couch, and there was another holding onto a horse. Yes, an actual horse. This family member lived in a house with a barn and horses. That photo was also saved, and I showed it to everyone. Pretty crazy to capture that many spirits or apparitions in one photo in one room. When I was in high school, I was home one night with my sister and her friend from across the alley. She was about 21 at the time. My mom was out of town on business, as she normally was a few times a month. We were in the living room watching TV when all 3 of us heard the basement door close. The basement door had a stop at the bottom that made a distinct sweeping noise. We were all very confused because our mom wasn't supposed to be home until the next evening. She normally came through the basement when she rode her bike home from work, but she would be getting dropped off by a cab at the front door if she was out of town. Our minds trying to make sense of it, we went to the basement door, and my sister called down, "Mom?" No response. She called again, and all 3 of us heard my mom's voice respond, "Yes?" We were relieved and relaxed a little, and we asked what she was doing at home early. We never got a response. Ran next door to our neighbor, who was a CPD officer. She swept the house and found nobody. In the 20 years I lived in that house, our neighbor came by 3 times for similar situations and never found anything. I have 2. My mom and I lived with her dad until he passed away when I was 4. My mom's mom passed when my mom was 15. The night he died, we were on the couch watching a movie, and I was lying on him and starting to fall asleep. We said our goodbyes shortly after, and all of us went to bed. I remember being woken up to flashing lights and strange people in the house, and I saw my mom crying. I knew something bad had happened, but I didn't know what. I looked out the window to see where the flashing lights were coming from, and I saw 2 people walking away. One turned around to look at me, and it was my grandfather. The other was a woman. At the time, I didn't know who it was, but as I got older, I started to believe it was my grandmother, and she came to take my grandfather away. It gives me a little bit of peace to know they're together. The second one didn't happen to me, and I'm not sure if it's paranormal, but it's still interesting. I have a family friend who works at the mall. Until this incident, they had never gone to the bank to do work transactions. Usually, a coworker did it for them. On this day, all of their coworkers were busy, so they had to go. As they're waiting in line, a woman who they had never seen before comes up to them and says, "I'm sorry to bother you, but do these initials mean anything to you?" They've been trying to get a message across, and they're quite persistent. My friend isn't a huge believer in that kind of stuff, but as soon as the woman said the initials, they started crying. It was their mom's initials, and the message was in response to things my friend had been wondering. Is she at peace? Can she see how big her great-granddaughter has gotten? Is she proud? Ever since then, she's been a believer. It was not really paranormal, more likely a hallucination due to sleep deprivation, but it was so vivid and real that it has haunted me for years. My bedroom had 2 entrances. One faced a hallway. The second was adjacent to the first and led to a common bathroom with another exit to the hallway, where, at the end, was my parents' bedroom. My desk was right next to both entrances, such that, at a certain angle, I could see both ends of the hall with a blind spot in the middle. So, back when I was in high school, I pulled all-nighters like a moron to finish my assignments. It was probably around 3 a.m., and I was sitting at my desk. I was dead tired and the only one awake. I glance at the hall and see a girl moving unnaturally slowly past my door, step, step, step. She had long black hair and wore a white dress. I couldn't see her face. She was completely silent, no footsteps, no rustle of clothes. She walked into that blind spot in the hallway and did not reappear at the other visible end. Just the sight of her paralyzed me. I became so unreasonably scared that I almost started to hyperventilate. I couldn't stop shaking. It was weird. I had a sister, but I knew it wasn't her because she didn't own any dresses like that and her hair wasn't that long. I sat in my own cold sweat for a while before I finally gathered the guts to move and check whether anyone was actually there. I went through the bathroom and peeked out the other end of the hallway. Of course, there was no one. Since then, I have always kept my door closed at night. It didn't happen to me, but it happened to my stepfather. I'm an immigrant from Armenia. Living in California since 1979. I'm 48 years old. This is background information because, well, you'll know why. My grandfather served in the Red Army during World War II. Armenia was one of the 15 Soviet Socialist republics, so almost every abled person was drafted. Anyway, during his deployment, I don't know where exactly he was, maybe Moscow, he had orders to get on a bus with his platoon and get to the next station. When he arrived at the bus depot, a strange old woman with a black suit covering her face walked up to him and started talking in a language he didn't understand. The lapel on his uniform caught the old woman's hand, and he was stuck, and she wouldn't let go of him. He complained to her that he's about to miss his bus. The bus left without him. Later on that day, he found out that the bus he was supposed to get on was involved in a freak accident, and some of the passengers perished. My dad told me this story when I was about 16 years old. The first time I met my stepfather was in 1989, when we went back to Armenia to visit. I helped some friends move into their new house. I asked him if anything was going on in the basement, and he shot me a look and said, "Nope, basements are haunted, so we're not going to use them." And in fact, the cats and the kids won't go anywhere near it to this day. Me being the overfeeler and overcurious type, I had to push the subject, and we ended up going down there. He was hesitant and obviously freaked out, so he let me walk down first, of course. I could feel it before I cleared the stairs. I could almost hear it buzzing, and the hairs started to stand on my whole body. I get creeped out thinking about it now. It smelled like dirt and was cold, even though it's fully carpeted, finished with heat, and has 2 bedrooms. It felt old and sad. There's an old piano down there that the previous owner couldn't take. He told me the piano had been occasionally making the noise of one key being pressed for the last few days. I wanted to turn and run up the stairs, but it was too late. I was committed. So I walked forward and opened one bedroom door, looked, and closed it. Then I opened the other bedroom door, looked, and tried to close it. But something was stopping it from closing. Like a door stopper had suddenly been placed in front of it. I pulled it a couple times and decided to look at what could be holding it open. On the other side of the door was an old, bent nail driven into the wall with an old leather string or bootlace of some kind knotted to it. That string had wrapped itself into a perfectly tied bow around the skinny part of the doorknob in the 2 seconds I had that door open. Seeing it tied in a perfect bow like that and knotted to that nail is an image I can't get out of my head. It wanted me to know it was there. They still live in that house and, unfortunately, have had nothing but problems with it. It's been spiritually blessed and ritually cleansed multiple times, and a lot of creepy and even bad things are still happening there. I was painting the master bath of a home my ex-fiancée and I had been in for about a year and a half. We had experienced paranormal sounds and events in the house prior to this. I had the bathroom a mess painting when suddenly the hair on my arm stood up and everything glitched like reality shifting for a second. Then I heard this angry old lady voice that had somewhat of an electric distortion to it, saying, "Stop messing up my bathroom." I was freaked out for a second, but calmed down at the paintbrush and said, "I can do that. I can stop doing anything to the house and let it deteriorate to the point that there is no house, or I can take care of it, love it, and let my family experience new memories here." We still experience some freaky events, but nothing like that again. Another time I was working at a hospital, and my office was located in a research building. I walked into the men's room and saw this old, humpbacked gentleman washing his hands. As humpbacked as he was, I felt sorry for him. He was in black sweatpants and a red and black checkered flannel shirt with a black toboggan on with blackish hair coming out around it. I was standing with my back to the door and looked to my right for a few seconds to scan the urinal and to see if the stall was empty. I turned back, and he was gone. It was impossible because I was fully blocking the only entrance or exit. He was as solid as you or I, and he vanished. I went to another restroom. I literally saw some sort of ritual. My parents used to live in a neighborhood that sat on a cliff overlooking the river. A spot on the cliff had pretty nice coverage from people because there were huge boulders and bushes, so it was a popular smoke spot for my buddies and me. One night, around midnight, my best friend and I snuck out to go smoke by the boulders with another friend of ours. It was a full moon that night, but there was a lot of overcast, so it was very dark. We heard a humming sound, like someone in the distance singing. She stood up to look around and immediately started motioning for me to get up and look quietly. In the middle of the river, directly in front of us, was a small island. There were at least 20 people with fucking cloaks on, and there were probably 10 small fires lit around them. They were singing something, and the little fires were dancing? I've never been able to really describe it. The little sparks on fires that usually just float up were floating sideways. And they were moving around so fast that it looked like they were dancing. I have never seen anything like that. We slowly and quietly sat back down where our stuff was and started putting everything away when we heard something, which I've also never really been able to explain. The cliff/river also hosts a large nature trail, so there's all sorts of noise. Rodents are moving through the bushes, and insects are doing insect stuff. I specifically remember hearing crickets. Suddenly, it went dead silent. Everything that existed around us stopped moving. You could hear a pin drop. We all kind of froze and looked at each other, and then we heard this super loud, almost electrical sounding noise, like static from a police radio. It sounded like it was coming up the side of the cliff at us. It instilled a fear in all of us like we'd never known. There were no words exchanged, we all simply got up and ran out of there as fast as we could. I don't know what it was, but it was terrifying. The next day, my best friend and I went back to the boulders to collect everything we left behind and also to look at the island in the daylight. There were obvious burn piles all over it, but the most obvious thing was that they were positioned on the ground to make a huge cross, and at the top of the cross was a huge burn pile. We never tried crossing the river to see everything up close and personal because, 1, I ain't getting close to that crap, and 2, I'm too lazy to crawl down the cliff and walk across the river. It's pretty shallow on both sides of the island. There are lots of ghost stories and urban legends in that area of town. About 1/4 mile down the river from the island is an old, abandoned slaughterhouse that people are always telling stories about. There are lots of stories of skinwalkers around there too. To this day, I still don't really understand what we saw that night, and I still don't understand why the electrical sound scared us so badly, but I will never ever forget that night. My husband won't go with me on haunted tours anymore. We went on a haunted walking tour of the French Quarter in New Orleans. It included a stop at the Bourbon Orleans Hotel. Very old and really beautiful. Part of the tour was in the Grand Ballroom. It was huge. As we entered, I heard children giggling. I thought it was just someone's kids. It is a hotel. As the guide was giving her speech, I found a chair within earshot and sat down. We had done a bit of walking, so I took advantage of the opportunity to sit. It started to get cold. Which is weird because it was a humid day. I felt a little, tiny hand gently touching my face. And I felt the same thing on my legs. Like a whole classroom full of kindergarteners wanting attention all at once. I put my hands up to my cheeks. The guide tells us, this room was used as a children's ward for yellow fever patients. Then she pointed to me and said, you stay at the back of the group going upstairs. I later asked her why. She said, you must be a mom. I am. She said, sometimes the children like to prank people. Like tripping them on the stairs. They targeted you. My husband went pale. We walked around the French Quarter and actually walked back to our own hotel. She ended the tour with, this is the beautiful Hotel Provincial. Building 5 was a surgery and morgue during the Civil War. We had no idea. My husband handed her a tip and said, I'm out. She laughed a bit. Until we walked into the hotel. We were in Building 3. Story number 2. My husband thought it would be a fun birthday present to book a haunted trolley tour in our town. My birthday is in October. It was an adorable black trolley with bats on the windows. Our first stop was in a place I had never been before. We get off, and it's a park with huge trees. I look at my husband and say, this is a cemetery. Where are the headstones? The guide says, oh, you have been on this tour before? I said, no. Her face. My husband agreed that it felt like a cemetery. It was an old pioneer cemetery, and the church used it to bury the nuns and priests there. Someone was supposed to remove and relocate the bodies. However, they just moved the headstones. When she said headstones, I pointed to the back corner and said, they are back there. We walked down the path to the back. She said, how did you know that? I said, I saw shadows in that direction. My husband just laughed. Story number 3. I went to tour a local haunted house, the Whaley House. It was August, and it was about 90 degrees outside. I was new to the area, and a coworker suggested it. It's an old town and a nice place to walk around. I go in. Pay for it. Self-guided. It was way back when they actually had a President Lincoln death mask in the case. I walked around the lower part and decided to go upstairs. The bedrooms were upstairs. I was told there was some beautiful furniture and old clothes up there. So I go up and peek my head into the bedrooms. They only had a velvet road across the doorway. You could lean in and look without crossing the threshold. I was up there completely alone. As I started down the stairs, I got a blast of ice-cold air on my back. It felt like someone opened a walk-in freezer behind me. I saw a docent at the foot of the stairs and said, wow, that air conditioning is strong. She smiled and said, this house has never had air conditioning. That's Mrs. Whaley. I left. I went to the restrooms behind the house. I splashed water on my face. I got a really creepy "why are you here?" feeling in that bathroom. I went back and asked the docent about the bathroom. She said, Violet Whaley shot herself in that bathroom when it was an outhouse. She died from it. I got my car keys and left. Lots more. This kind of stuff has happened to me my whole life. But I did drown twice. Beach and pool. A friend of mine is also interested in the paranormal. We were going on a ghost hunt one evening. I don't know why, but I asked, which beach did you drown at? Huntington or Newport? Her eyes got huge. She said, Huntington. She never said anything about drowning as a kid. She never told anyone.